Hey, what is up guys, Eli for MOBOXgraphics.com. In this video we will be modeling the iPhone X or iPhone X as most people call it by now. And by doing that we will be covering a lot of different techniques. So let's get started. The easiest way to do this is actually searching a blueprint image of the iPhone on Google Images, for example. And we will be using that as a reference background in Cinema 4D. To set up this image as the background, you need to open the different panels in the viewport. And let's start with the front panel, for example. You need to go to the Options menu and then go to Configure. And in the Back tab, which could be opened by default, you have to go to the Image field and just enter the image of the blueprint. Let's also increase the transparency so it is easier to see the geometry we will be making. Let's also do the same thing on the other views, but I'm going to speed this up for you. Okay, when that is done, let's start and use the front view. And we will be making the overall base shape of the iPhone, which is the front-facing image. So what we can do now is actually using a rectangle spline instead of a cube, and you'll see why later. So let's get that one. And you can see the image at the background isn't exactly centered with the rectangle. And it is easier to keep your geometry centered to the scene and just move the image behind it. So what we can do again is going in the options and go to configure. And here at the offset you can change the position of the background. So let's make sure it is kind of centered with the cross in the middle of the screen. So when that is done, we can go back to the rectangle and scale it so it fits the rough shape of the iPhone. Because we were using the rectangle instead of a cube, it is really easy to get these rounded corners. You can just select the rounding option down here and adjust the radius until it fits the drawing. 35 centimeters seems alright for this one. In the perspective view you can see it is just a line right now, but we want this to be a solid shape, which we can do by going up here and using the extrude object and dragging the rectangle inside of it. Now by doing this we also have the nice feature, when we go to the extrude object itself, you can go to the caps tab and you can swap the regular cap for a fillet cap on both options. And that way we have nice rounded edges. Right now it is not smooth enough to be like an iPhone, but we can do that by adding some steps on both sides. Something like 5 will do, and then we need to increase the radius as well. Something like 10 centimeters seemed to work pretty well for me. Now if we go back to the front view, you can actually see the iPhone got bigger. One thing we need to do to fix this is checking the constraint option down here. This will stop it from growing. But on the other hand, on the right side, you can see it is also getting quite thick. So when we decrease the radius, you can see it is actually shrinking. This makes it kind of hard to make it exactly as deep as the image on the background. But first we will need to set up this image anyway, so let's go back to the options and configure. And we will be using the offset values to make it overlap each other. So right now you can see it is actually way too big. So let's go back to the object tab of the extrude object. And we will be decreasing the extrusion to something more like probably even 3 centimeters or something. So let's see when we move the background image back in place. I guess this will do for now. Another thing I want to do before moving on is going back to the extrude object, going in the caps tab, and we will also be checking the create single object. So when we make it editable later, it is just one single object instead of the caps being a separate object of the shape itself. Okay, last thing I want to do now is setting up the top image, which should be just moving the background image, as the scale of the iPhone should be alright right now. So let's do that. Okay, now could be a good time to make the object editable by pressing C, and you should end up with just one object. The next thing I want to do is making the extrusion on the screen, or the inner extrusion to be correct. So what we can do is using the polygon mode and selecting this front polygon, and you can see there is an inner line right here, which is the actual outline of the screen. So what we can do is pressing I for the inner extrude tool and making an extrusion all the way so it hits the top line here at the notch. So what I would like to do now is cutting out the notch. This can be done by using the knife tool, which can be accessed by pressing K and K again. And you can keep the visible only option turned on. And I'm going to start the cut right here at this point, so the intersection of the notch. Move down while holding shift and try to make it line up with this horizontal line. Click again, hold shift again, make it line up with the vertical line right here. Click again and make it end while holding shift again at this top line. Now you can press escape to end the cutting. And it should be just like this right now. The next thing to make the curves at the sides here is going to the point mode and select both the bottom points while holding shift. Right click and use the bevel tool. And when we increase the subdivisions, it should be quite smooth like this. So 5 seems to work pretty well for us. Now let's also select these 2 points at the top. And this curve will not need to be so big, so we can use a smaller offset for this one. You maybe also want to select the limit option so it isn't intersecting with the other curve. Okay, so that is done now, but in the perspective view, you will notice there isn't actually anything visible of the screen, but we already made the cut, so when we are adding the screen material and so on, it will be a lot easier. For the next step, we will be adding the buttons and the cutouts for the buttons, so they are actually inside of the iPhone and not just laying on top of it. The easiest way to do this is actually using the bool object. I know it is not very popular by modelers because it often creates some weird geometry in the polygons, but for this it seemed to work quite fine because it is just a rounded cube. So let's already drag the extrude inside of the bool. And now let's start by creating our first button. I'm going to do this at the right side here. So what we can do is actually using another rectangle spline and try to line it up with the image. You will see it is not perfectly centered, so you might need to move it a little to the center of this polygon. And we also need to scale it down a lot, of course. And when you're done, you can check the rounding option again and try to increase the radius to its maximum value. So that's 2 perfect rounded ends. Also, a quick tip to keep the polygons around the button smoother when we will be cutting it out is making sure the rectangle is inside of a polygon. So you want it to be rather close to the left side of the line here instead of the right side of the line. Okay, let's go ahead and make this a solid object by using the extrude object again and drag the rectangle inside of it. And you'll see there's some kind of sketchy extrusion going on. It seems to go sideways even. So what we need to do is going in the extrude object and let's remove this 20 centimeters on this side, and I guess it is on the first value. You can make it large enough because this will be the cutout object, so not the button itself. So what we could do now is making a group already with the extrusion inside of it and drag it under the bool object. We also need to make sure the iPhone is above the extrusions of the buttons. Let's also rename this so we know what this is. And if we move the rectangle back in a little, you will see we have a nice cutout. I placed this extrusion inside of this null because a bool object will only calculate the intersection between the first and the second object. So if we added 10 buttons under this, it would only cut out the first button. But if we place it in a group, it looks like one object for the bool. So what we could do now is going back in the side view and just duplicating this extrusion to the bottom so it overlaps the second button. You can also see there are a lot of lines and this makes it a lot harder to see what we are doing. So go to the bool object and we want to hide the new edges. You can also check the create single object for later on and maybe even create func breaks at intersections. Okay, there was one more cutout at the top here, but this one is a little smaller. So what we could do is duplicating one of these buttons to the top, and we will go inside of it to change the rectangle its shape, which will need to be a little smaller. And also the ends don't need to be perfectly rounded, just a little less. So I guess 2 centimeters works for this one. So let's take a look at the perspective, and that seems to work pretty well. You can see there are some rough edges right here, but we will see if we need to fix them later on. It is the best option to add all the cutouts and then see if we need to smooth out some things. Now we want to add the actual buttons, which can be done by just copying this cutouts group and paste it outside of the bool. We will also rename this to buttons, of course. And you can already see the buttons, but we want them to be just a little smaller so we can see a gap right here. So let's do that individually by going to the rectangle itself and decreasing the size by something like 1 centimeter, I guess. We can also do this with the other one as well and move them together so they are exactly lined up with each other. And the last thing we need to do is going to the extrude object of it and going to the caps option so we can add a fillet cap. Let's also make sure we add the constraint option. And I guess for these it is the end cap which we need to modify. Yeah, like this. So we can even reset the original start cap. Right now this glitched because of the big radius, so let's decrease that to something like 1 centimeter. And we will use 2 steps to make it a little smoother. That looks like some nice buttons for now. Let's do the same thing with the extrusion at the top here. But this one is a switch and not a button, so we need to make it a lot smaller. So let's go and make it something like 2 or 3 centimeters. I'm also going to move this in again. And also move it to the side so it is switched to one side, of course. Make it less tall. 1 centimeter seems alright. And of course we need to add the end cap. Don't forget to check the constraint option. And for this one, because it is such a small switch, we can even use a value of 0.3 for the radius. And also add 2 steps to make it smoother. So that is how we can make some buttons on the iPhone. I am going to do the same thing on the other side, but to do that we need the reference image again. But we don't have the left side set up already, so I guess the right side is done for now. So I'm going to switch the camera to left and also change the offset of the background image so it overlaps the left one. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing with this button right here on the left side, and I will speed this up because it's just the same technique. Okay, so that's that button. Right here you also have something that looks like a button, but it isn't. This is actually the SIM card slot, so it's just flush with the whole body. And we only need some kind of edge cutout on this line right here. We can do that by creating another rectangle and resize it so it fits the image. Also enable derounding, but we are not going to extrude this one. We will try to make this line to be a solid shape itself, so with a cutout in the middle as well. The easiest way to do this is adding another rectangle and scale it down until it is small like this. And now when we add a sweep object and place those 2 rectangles inside of it, we can take a look and see if it works. And you might have something that looks like this, which is not correct. That is because we need to find the small rectangle, so that's the upper one. And we can set the plane orientation to something like XY to make it work. It looks like the sweep is still a little large, so I'm going to scale down this top rectangle even more. Also, you don't want it to be uniformly scaled, you want the height to be quite large, so it is deep enough to cut out the shape, and the width can be really thin. So let's drag this under the cutouts and move this rectangle in a little so we can see what is cutting out. And that seems alright. I'm going to scale down this top rectangle even a little more, so it's really thin. And I guess that looks alright. I also feel like it isn't perfectly centered, so that is also something I'm going to fix by selecting the buttons and the extrusions and the cutouts. And let's take a look in the side view. I'm going to place them something more like this. That looks better. One last thing we need for the SIM card slot is a small hole at this spot. This is an easy one and can just be done with a small cylinder, which we will rotate and scale down. And then we can put it in the cutouts group. Okay, so that are the sides. One last thing we need to cut out is the bottom, which will have the charger port and the speaker grill. So for that I'm going to change the top view to the bottom view. So go to cameras and bottom. And I'm going to change the offset of the background image again. Something like this. So let's start with these small holes right here on both sides. As you could expect, these are some cylinders again. So let's drag one on there to define the shape and the size. And after that we will create a cloner object and drag that cylinder inside of it. And we can keep the linear mode, and we need 6 of them for each side. So let's set it to 6. And I'm going to drag the first one in place right here. And right now it is making steps in the Y value, so we can't see it in this view. It's going up the phone instead of to the right. So let's turn this back to 0. And we want it to move on the X value, I guess. And just play with the values until it fits over the circles. 7.5 is the value I will be using. So now I can just duplicate this cloner to the other side and it will also fit just fine. While we're at it, I'll also create some cutouts where the screws will go right here next to the charger. So I'm just going to duplicate one of these cylinders, place it on top and maybe even scale it up a little, and also drag one to the other side. Let's make sure we also drag them inside of the cutouts group, like this, and let's take a look if it works. We need to drag it to the bottom, of course, like that. And now we have some nice cuts down here. One last cutout we need is the charger port, which will also be a rectangle again. So scale it down and add the rounding on the corners again. Make sure the radius is set to the maximum value. And we can use an extrude object again, so we can place a rectangle inside of it. And making sure the extrusion is going in the right direction. Like this. Let's drag it under the cutouts again. And the actual charger hole has this kind of rim around it that makes your connector stuck inside of it so it doesn't escape. And we will be doing that by selecting this last rectangle we made and copy it and paste it outside of the bowl again. And we will be making a sweep on this again. So let's get another smaller rectangle. It can be really small again. Also make sure it is in the right orientation. Mine is on the XY orientation. I guess it is the XZ orientation I need. We can also add some rounding to it because it is a soft shape. And now let's add the sweep object again and drag both of these rectangles inside of it. And we should have something that looks okay. Let's see if I need to rotate this small rectangle. And you can see the XY value gives the best result again. I'm also going to increase the radius a little so it is even softer. I think 0.3 is a good value for this. And now we need to drag it in place so it actually fits in the charger port. Of course, we also need to scale this down a little. I forgot that. One last thing we can do at the bottom here is adding the screws right here. What I'm going to do is using the cylinders we used for the cutouts, so let's find these back again. And I'm going to duplicate them outside of the bowl. We can also scale these down a little in the height, so it isn't as tall anymore. And I'm also going to add a fillet on these caps so it is more rounded like a screw is. The radius can be a little less rounded so it is still somewhat flat, like this. Okay, so what we can do now is selecting both of these cylinders and group them together. And place them inside of a bool object. So we can make this kind of star shape it has inside of it. We can do that by going up here and selecting a star spline. And I will also need to set the XY value to XZ, I guess. Let's go to the bottom view to make sure it actually fits. We can already center it to the cylinder here, and I'm going to scale it down quite a lot. so it fits. And of course it doesn't need to be this sharp. I'm also going to decrease the points to something like 5 points. And we can increase the inner radius, something like this. Let's scale it down even more. Now we need to add an extrude object again, so we can make it a solid shape. Make sure it is extruding in the right direction. And now we can drag it under that new bool object. We also need to drag it down a little so it intersects with that cylinder. And I also need to change the order inside of the bool to make it work. Let's make sure it isn't going too deep, because a screw isn't like that. And I'm also going to make a group of this by pressing Alt and G, so I can make a duplicate of this star inside of it and drag it to the other side of the bottom. So this way we have 2 screws with the star shape inside of it. Okay, we are getting real close now. Some of the last pieces we need are around the camera at the front and the camera at the back. We need to cut out the shape for the speaker grill right here, and also for the front camera. It is just the same technique again. We will be using a rectangle for the speaker with some rounding on it. And put that inside of an extrude object. Now make sure it is inside of the cutouts group we've made earlier. And I'm also going to make sure it isn't cutting as deep as this. Another thing I'm going to do is duplicating this extrusion outside of the cutouts and make it a lot less tall, so I can apply a texture on this later on. The next cutout we needed was the camera, which is this little circle right here next to the speaker on the right. Of course this will be just another cylinder again. And we will also put this under the cutouts group again. Make sure it isn't going too deep, or decrease the height of the cylinder. It also looks like my camera is mirrored or something, because the camera hole is at the left right now, while I did it at the right here. And that is because on this front projection something seems to be wrong, because these buttons at the right here should be at the other side. I hope this didn't happen for you, but what I'm going to do is just change this camera from front to back to fix this. I know the name isn't corresponding with the actual view, but it is fixing this for me right now. So let's remove the cutout right now. And that is much better. I'm also going to duplicate this cylinder outside of the bool again. And I'm also going to apply some lines on this so I can see what I will be modeling. And what I actually want to do is making this cylinder editable, so I can select all these front polygons and make an inner extrusion like this. Move it in a little so we get this kind of dome effect. And now make another extrusion outwards again, which will represent the lens, of course. And with the bevel tool we can make some rounding on this to make it look something like a lens. Maybe I will even undo this and move it in a little again before making the bevel, so it isn't as tall. Like this. For the other sensors you can see at the front here, I will just use some disk objects, which we can do in this front view, or back view as it is called in mine. And just put them in place and scale them down until it fits. Before moving on, we need to make sure they are actually on top of the iPhone instead of inside of it. And that is all the modeling we need to do for the front. I also see the notches cut out at the wrong side in my case, so I'm just going to select that base shape under the bool object. And I'm actually going to merge these new polygons we made together again to get rid of it. And I will just redo it on the other side. So these are basically the same steps as we saw earlier in the video. Okay, so I quickly fixed this for my model. Let's go ahead and make this back camera and wrap things up. I'm going to change this bottom camera to the back camera. I guess I will need to set it to the front camera in my case, but for you it should be the back camera. And I'm also going to change the offset again of the image. And once again we can start off with a rectangle again. Drag it in place, resize it, and add some rounding on it. Now we can place this under an extrude object again. And let's go in the perspective view to see what is going on. We can add a fillet cap on this. And also make sure the constraint tag is selected again. And this time we will not select create single object, because I want the caps to be separate. You will see why in just a second. The fillet seems to be alright. If you look at the front view, or the back view in your case, you can see the line is matching the drawing. Let's check the side view and make sure it is not sticking out too much. Maybe it also doesn't need the fillet cap. I see it is just a straight line, so I'm actually going to disable it again and make sure it is tall enough again. Now let's make this object editable and search for that front cap, so in my case cap 1. I'm going to select this front polygon and make an inner extrusion to fit the drawing, like this. And maybe we can just move this a little outwards so there is some kind of bevel to it. And now we can start and make the holes for the camera and add the lenses inside of it. Let's go to this view again and add a cylinder again. Rotate it so we can put it on top of these circles. The center one is a little smaller. Let's group these, and we will need a new bool object for the camera. Drag this extrusion, which is the camera, and the new null inside of the bool object. I'm going to select create single object again, hide new edges. And we need to change the order again. And now we have a cutout for the lenses. For the lenses, I guess it is just the easiest to just find this one at the front and copy and paste it so we can rotate it around and put it in place. For the centerpiece, it will just be the flash. So I will search the cylinder we used to make the cutout and paste it outside of it. And this will be textured later on to be the flash object. Okay, one last thing before adding the materials to this is making some cuts on the sides so we can apply the antenna material on them. So I'm going to search for that base object, the extrusion. I'm going to call it base even. And you want to select all these polygons at this side. Also on the other side. Now in the back or front view you can go ahead and look here. And we only want them to be selected up to this second black line. So what we can do under the live selection tool is deselecting the only select visible elements. And while holding Ctrl or Command, deselect the polygons we don't need. And also do the same thing on the other side. Okay, what we can do now is pressing K and L for the loop cut. Make sure restrict to selection is turned on. And now we will make some cuts where the antenna line should be. Let's also do the same thing on the bottom. And this way we have the geometry to apply the materials on. Let's also quickly fix this right here. And that way we made it to the end for the iPhone model. I hope it wasn't too confusing because I switched the front and back view, but I hope that didn't happen to you. If you want to see how to set up the materials for this iPhone and the lighting studio to make it look like shown on the Apple images, then make sure to check out the second part of this tutorial. I will see you there.